What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are here with the Ultimate Avengers. And for those of you guys who are familiar with what's happening in the Ultimate Universe right now, bear with me here for a second while I provide a bit of a refresher for people who are not. So if you're not really familiar with the Ultimate Avengers and what's happening right now, in Marvel Comics, the Ultimate Universe, as it had been established in the year 2000, had basically been wiped out in Secret Wars 2015. Yes, it kind of continued on, but not really. Marvel ignored any appearances that it had after Secret Wars. Instead, they launched a story in 2023 called Ultimate Invasion. And what it did is it established that Reed Richards from the original Ultimate Universe, who was essentially a villain, had traveled to like a random universe and just started structuring things in order to make this universe or make this Earth what he wanted it to be. A couple good examples here in getting into this comic is that Captain America has only recently been discovered and he's still in a block of ice. That was one of the changes that Reed had made. He had made it so that Captain America was never discovered after being frozen. Thor, of course, is laying on a bed and he's gravely injured. This was another thing that Ultimate Reed Richards, also known as the Maker, had basically done, is he had set things up so that Loki took the throne of Asgard instead of Thor. And of course, ultimately Thor escapes and so on and so forth. But what we also do here is we pick up with Iron Lad and Dr. Doom. Now, Iron Lad is basically Tony Stark in this new universe, this new Ultimate Universe. The difference here is that instead of him going on to become Iron Man, his father, Howard Stark, became Iron Man. And what ended up going on here is that in an attack by the Illuminati, kind of this inner circle organization founded by the Maker, secretly controlling the world behind the scenes, that it had essentially engineered an attack on Stark Industries and then blamed it on Tony Stark. He and Dr. Doom from this universe fled 6 months into the future. And that's where we pick up here, where Tony Stark says, I know it doesn't look good. To review, we've escaped 6 months into the future. Thousands died in the attack on Stark Tower, which was meant for us. The perpetrators of that attack, a conspiracy of the worst and most powerful people imaginable, have taken control of both the planet and the narrative. The world thinks we're violent terrorists. Also, our most powerful ally is gravely injured. Another is trapped in ice. And in 18 months, the devil breaks out of hell. Now, here's the cool kicker about this. The fact that they've traveled 6 months into the future, if you're familiar with comics, you already know this. If you're unfamiliar, comic books run in usually 6-month installments, which is to say it takes 6 issues to wrap up a singular story arc. Right now, Ultimate Spider-Man, Ultimate X-Men, Ultimate Black Panther, they're a few months into their runs, right? Like 2 or 3 issues in. So the idea here is that with issue number 6, they'll essentially catch up with this moment right here as far as time progression goes. The other thing is that the Maker was kind of defeated, but ultimately locked in this giant dome. And so at the end of that time period, he will emerge. And because time in that dome passes differently, meaning thousands of years will have passed for the Maker instead of 18 months, there's no real indication of what things are going to be like when he comes out. But what it essentially does is it creates a kind of timetable. It says 6 months after the release of Ultimate Universe number 1, basically the 6-issue story arcs of all these characters, they'll catch up here and basically become part of the Ultimates, or at the very least, begin to consolidate with the forces of Tony Stark. In 18 months, we get the conclusion of how things happen with the Maker. Then the Ultimate Universe is off to the races, and who knows what it's going to look like after that, although I am excited. And so what ends up happening is Tony Stark and Dr. Doom try to figure out a way to set the universe right. Now, one of the things that had happened here is that when the Maker had shown up in this random universe, because the Ultimate Universe was effectively gone, all the information, right, the archetypes of superheroes as he knew them, was actually taken from the main Marvel universe. So all the information that he had on what kind of person Captain America was, what kind of person Black Panther was, it's not based on their depictions in the original Ultimate Universe, that alternate reality line of comics. Instead, it's based on their characters from the main Marvel universe. And so that's why what you have here is Tony Stark and Dr. Doom, who sit down and have this conversation where Tony Stark says, we've traveled 6 months into the future, Doom. It's June. It's not that complicated. And Doom says, we have a time machine. You said it, but did you understand it? With the Immortus engine, we can act simultaneously in the past, present, and the future. You'll have to think and 4 dimensions if you want to change the world. And so that's where Stark is just kind of like, okay, then what do we do? Because his initial response is, if we have a time machine, let's just go back in time and undo everything that the Maker did. But the reality here is, they don't know the full extent of the changes that he made because they don't know how the universe was supposed to be. And that's the benefit of somebody like the Maker, right? That when you are Reed Richards from the original Ultimate Universe and you show up to this random universe, you can just kind of hover like a spacecraft in the sky, and you can just watch how this Earth unfolds over the course of a year. Then you can use time travel to travel 6 months into the future and see what the world looks like. So you kind of get this beginning to end of how this universe unfolds. And because you have all that information, you can go to any point in Earth and change something. But because you're not keeping a diary of the changes that you're making, there's no way for anyone to retrace your steps. And that's the problem that the Ultimates have. They could go back in time and they could give Peter Parker the radioactive spider so he's bitten and becomes Spider-Man, but like, it's not going to follow the exact same form and function that it would have had the Maker never shown up in the first place. And so what they do is they come up with a better situation. That what they say is, okay, if we cannot set this Earth back to the way that it's supposed to be, then let's at least give it back its superheroes. And so what they do is they come up with the idea of the Ultimates, basically the Ultimate Universe version of the Avengers. And Tony Stark says it will be a kind of superhero resistance network created from the post-human catalysts and files we stole from the Maker, connected by Stark Tech and Common Cause, small at first, but growing exponentially as we add new nodes. Now, this is just Tony Stark talking in like tech speech, but what he's basically saying here, right, when he says like post-human catalysts and files, it's essentially saying, according to the Maker, Peter Parker was supposed to become Spider-Man. The catalyst was being bitten by a radioactive spider. Done. When he says nodes, he's talking about individual people, right? Spider-Man, Black Panther, the X-Men, anybody else who's out there. And so that's why if you go back and you read the individual stories from the Ultimate Universe right now, Ultimate Black Panther, Ultimate Spider-Man, it's Tony Stark appearing as a hologram, dropping off these boxes and saying, this is who you were supposed to be, but that was robbed from you. And in fact, you'll see that play out over the course of this with a couple of surprise characters that you never saw coming. But what happens is a question's asked by Dr. Doom. He says, you propose we recreate this other world here, this Earth 616, referring to the main Marvel universe, because again, that's where all of the information that the Maker has came from, right? The character profiles on superheroes. And Stark says, I propose we put right what the Maker put wrong to help this world become the world it's supposed to be, a world of heroes. But Doom makes a very interesting counterpoint here. He says, this world is not that one, not the main Marvel universe. Realities diverge. The Maker has purged himself of mercy. The people in these files are likely dead. And that's where Stark says, then we'll have to find replacements. And so once these origin boxes are dropped off to these various people in the past, Peter Parker, Black Panther, so on and so forth, that what you do is you have them waking up Steve Rogers. And the funny thing here is Steve Rogers takes it about as well as you could expect. Like in Captain America, the First Avenger, when he wakes up and he just bolts out of a room that he immediately realizes is a false room because they were playing a radio broadcast for a baseball game that he was actually at. And of course, takes off into the streets of New York City and just sort of gets surrounded by S.H.I.E.L.D. in Times Square. God, I miss the days when the MCU was just so well established and put together. But he, of course, fights back here and loses it and really has a hard time grappling with reality. He comes to terms with it pretty fast, but as this mission is being undertaken and these kind of origin boxes are being sent out, Captain America tells them this is not going to work. He says you cannot start a revolution from your living room. Revolutions start on the ground, and heroes do not come out of boxes. It simply just won't work. Now, there is a kind of truth to what he's saying here, but it's also him just being old hat and just being stuck in the ways that things were done way back when. when it comes to like a boots on the ground affecting change on a societal level, yeah, you're not going to do it from like a computer, right? You're not going to change the world with a Twitter hashtag. It's just never going to happen. And the same thing is done here. You're not going to change the world by just developing these devices and sending it out there to people and saying, you will all be united for a common cause. The reality is they have to experience the world and see the world through new eyes and new lenses. 6 months is not enough time to do that. If you look, for example, at the character of Peter Parker, over the course of a period of time which spanned longer than 6 months, Peter Parker lost Uncle Ben, then he lost Gwen Stacy, and those 2 deaths alone solidified 2 absolute truths for Spider-Man Peter Parker. Number 1, with great power must also come great responsibility. If you have the ability to stop something bad from happening, then you have the responsibility to do so, lest it affect you in a personal way that you couldn't imagine, i.e. the death of Uncle Ben. The death of Gwen Stacy taught him he cannot be reckless. And so those are the kind of experiences that Captain America's talking about, that these guys have to live the world under the guise of being a new hero. But at the same time, he's not necessarily giving them their credit because he doesn't know these guys. He doesn't know what Peter Parker is like on a personal level. He doesn't know if Peter Parker would accept the offering of the origin box that he's supposed to be Spider-Man, or if he would decline the offer. Now, of course, we know Peter Parker accepts it, but Captain America doesn't. And so without having all the information, all he's really doing is just making assumptions, which there is a time and a place for that. And it's usually never, because you're never going to draw a good conclusion because of it. But the fact remains here, right, that they really kind of discard the perception of Captain America. The origin boxes are all sent out along with a holographic message from Tony Stark telling people this is who you're supposed to be. And then they just wait, right? Now, the cool thing about time travel and about them being where they're at is they send the boxes 6 months into the past, right? So the button gets pushed, the electricity and all that stuff happens, the boxes disappear, then they walk over to a computer screen and just see how it all played out. That's the beauty of being in the future and sending stuff into the past. But what they realize is the world is still largely the same, that nothing has really changed here. And in fact, in some ways, it's actually worse, because what they realize is that by just giving people powers and saying, this is who you're supposed to be, some people walked away from that role. Some people became superheroes and then lost something very close to them and walked away from it. Some people didn't fully understand the totality of their powers and got themselves killed. So it wasn't really as simple as just appearing and calling it a day. And what's really cool about this is even in Marvel Comics in the main Marvel Universe, that's how it works. A really good example of this is Kevin Conley, I think it was. I don't remember if that was his exact name. Maybe it was Kenneth. But it was basically the kid from Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers, the last white event, where this kid was just given the power of the Star Brand, which means that he has enough power to defeat whoever he's facing at any point in time. It's the biggest MacGuffin ever in comic books. But when his powers first manifested, he wiped out an entire college campus, and the Avengers, who were trying to track him down at the time, arrived right after it happened. But they took him into custody and then said, you need to learn how to use your powers. That wasn't happening here. Instead, these guys were just given abilities, and then whatever happened, happened. Because what you need is an experienced guiding hand to teach you how to be a hero, but to teach you how to use your powers responsibly as well, by people who understand the nature of those powers. Professor Xavier leading the X-Men, Doctor Strange and people with magic, even though he was annihilated by Dormammu in like one fell swoop in the original Ultimate Universe. You guys remember that? He died immediately. It was hilarious. But the fact is, right, they almost consider it a little hopeless, because in a lot of ways, what they expected to see over the course of this 6-month period was that these superheroes would start rising up in spectacular fashion, and they would cast off these forces that have kept them in chains. And even if the world was in a state of absolute chaos, they would be able to walk over to that view screen, see how the world looks right now, and see potentially some kind of civil war, right, among the superheroes versus the status quo, and the people who don't want to see things change, right? Regular citizens, those operating behind the scenes, whatever the case happens to be. And so what they realize here is that the idea of sending origin boxes into the past was the wrong idea, that a personal touch was absolutely needed here. So what you end up doing is you pick up with Hank Pym and Janet Van Dyne. This is cool because what happens is they're basically called, by this restaurant owner who says there's a kind of pest issue down in the basement, right? He says it's like rats or something along those lines. When they get down there, they actually see that it's Moloids. Now, Moloids are like these subterranean mole-type creatures that exist in the Ultimate Universe. They exist in the original Marvel Universe. They exist in Old Man Logan, but they actually eat everybody. It's kind of crazy. It's pretty nuts. Like, literally, folks would just be walking across the road, and the Moloids would just pop up and just grab them and drag them into the ground and just consume them, right? It's pretty gruesome, and it's pretty dark. But one of the things that goes on is that the Moloids have a culture, and so when Janet Van Dyne and Hank Pym realize what's going on, they're like, no, we're not killing these guys. We're not going to kill anything that buries its dead or has a culture that understands the concept of right and wrong, that can feel fear, because that all points to sentience, and we're not going to kill sentient beings. And so they effectively abandon it, right? Even though they're offered like triple their original cost. Now, one of the things that's also discussed here is they talk about dreams, where Janet Van Dyne talks about a dream she had where like she woke up and all the furniture in the house was out of proportion, that everything was much bigger than it should have been. Now, of course, that's her dreaming about being the Wasp, right? I mean, you guys figure that out instantly. You don't need me to tell you that. But Hank Pym is also struggling with something very personal to him, and we'll find out what it is as time goes on. But in the midst of all this, they're suddenly met by the arrival of Tony Stark and the rest of the Ultimates, who have used the time machine to travel back to the present day and meet with Hank Pym and Janet Van Dyne. Now, while this happens, Hank Pym suddenly starts to panic and he starts to freak out. And he tells Janet, like, I would never do anything to hurt you, right? It's very suspicious because it's not every day that like your partner, right, your husband looks to you and says, hey, I know we're talking about having kids and stuff like that, but I would never do anything to hurt you, right? Like, it's the start of a conversation that's probably going to result in your imminent demise. You know what I mean? Like, it's not what you do, right? It's just weird, man. Just very, very weird. And it takes Janet by surprise. But even when they just kind of ignore Tony Stark and start like veering, driving all over the place, Thor, of course, sends his hammer down. He destroys the engine and the car. And you basically have Tony Stark, who shows up alongside Thor and Sif, who's accompanying him, who is actually trying to drag him back to Asgard because, like he's basically been framed for the death of Odin, alongside like Captain America and Doctor Doom. And you get this really cool revelation here where you end up finding that Hank Pym and Janet Van Dyne got one of the origin boxes, but Hank Pym hid it. He never showed it to Janet Van Dyne. So she doesn't know that like she's supposed to be a superhero. She doesn't know that inside this box are all the tools that she needs, Pym particles and all that kind of stuff, in order to become Wasp. That instead, the life that she's been living, where they're basically just a husband and wife running a pest control company and talking about kids, that's pretty much it. Right? That's just like the height of her life. That's the best that it will ever be. And so when Tony Stark appears, while at the same time this kind of box broadcast is taking place. So that's why you see Tony Stark as a hologram, but then you see Tony Stark as a person. It's basically just like the message that was in the box. But like when they see Tony Stark, Janet Van Dyne freaks out. Because remember, in Ultimate Invasion, the whole idea was the Illuminati, this kind of secret organization operating behind the scenes that was created by the Maker for the purpose of controlling the world. They orchestrated an attack on Stark Industries and then blamed it on Tony Stark. That's why he and Doctor Doom fled into the future with the frozen Captain America and Thor in the first place. Because if they stayed, they were public enemy number one. It was only a matter of time before they were tracked down and summarily executed, right? And so as a result of that, Janet Van Dyne sees him and immediately lashes out, right? Like attacks him. And he says, do you really think that I would have done something like that? Like, come on, like I know you don't know me, but let's be honest here. And so what he does is he spills the beans, right? He's like, this world is broken. You know that it's screwed up. I can see it in your faces, in the sad slump of your shoulders. Well, we are going to fix it and we need your help. Now, Captain America, of course, chimes in and he says, it's been 6 months and you have not accepted our offer. I don't blame you. You must have thought you'd be alone, which is why we've come in person. We wanted to be the ones to tell you. And that's where Janet's like, what are you talking about? Right? Like, Hank, like, what are they referring to? And that's when you kind of get the realization she never knew. And so while this explanation is going down, you suddenly have the arrival of Captain Britain, who speaks French. Captain Britain is a man from France, and as I understand it, British people hate French people because they're French. I don't know if there's really any other reason besides that. I mean, I never had a problem with French guys, but I asked a British guy once when I was in London. I asked him, I was like, why do British people hate French people? And he's like, because they're French. So that's kind of an interesting little thing there. But basically, it's just kind of like a member of the Illuminati along with his forces attacking everyone. And so it's designed to kind of be a distraction and sort of show that, like, yes, them showing up here was noticed. Not a great big huge deal. It's not the most important thing that goes down. Instead, one of the cool revelations that happens is Hank Pym, because what you learn is that when Hank Pym was given the origin box by Tony Stark, that yes, it contained the blueprint of the person he was supposed to become. And in effect, this box showed the life and times of Hank Pym from the main Marvel universe. Now, if you guys are unfamiliar with the nature of his character, he's not like Michael Douglas in the MCU. Hank Pym is about as insecure as a human being can be. He always likes to act like he's the smartest one in the room, and he is incredibly intelligent, but he never really has any confidence in himself. He's always going through these kind of like personal crises. He never really sits down and is just okay with who he is at that point in time, while also recognizing that we as people are a constant work in progress, because two things can be true at the same time. And so when Hank Pym sees this and he sees the person that he's supposed to become, instead of just relishing in the idea that he can be a superhero, instead he's afraid that he'll become Hank Pym in the main Marvel universe, failing to take into account they're not the exact same people, because they haven't lived the exact same lives and they haven't done the exact same things. And so what you end up getting is Janet Van Dyne, who celebrates the idea of becoming a superhero. She loves it. She's like, yeah, I can shrink down really small and attack people. This is amazing. Which is exactly how I would respond too, honestly, if I suddenly found myself with powers. And so while Hank Pym is quite literally living up to the fear that he'll become the person from the main Marvel universe who would do exactly this. I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if I'm strong enough, if I have enough courage. Captain America's like, dude, squash that nonsense. Here's the thing, man. You don't know what the future holds for you. I know that you are not that Hank Pym, that you haven't lived the same life as that guy. So why are you consigning yourself to the guilt and shame of a person that is not you? That's ridiculous, right? The reality here is you have space and time to become your own man, to become the kind of superhero that you want to be. Your fate is not guaranteed. And so what you get is this really cool moment where, like, everybody's being attacked. Janet Van Dyne flies through like a soldier's head, and then she comes out covered in like blood and brain matter and just starts like puking her guts up in the corner. You know, it's pretty crazy. Thor strikes down lightning, but he's a one-trick pony due to his injury, almost immediately starts to succumb to his injury, so not a whole lot that he can do. And so in the end, right, when you have like Iron Man at the heel of Captain Britain, who again is a Frenchman, which is just really kind of weird, and it seems like the day is lost, that just like this giant foot descends on everybody, and these soldiers just like firing up at it like it's gonna do anything. Literally, Hank Pym turned into Jax from Mortal Kombat 3, and he just like steps on everybody. Just like crushes them all and just leaves them there, right? And so ultimately, like, these guys take off, they leave, right? The Ultimates end up going back. And so what it means is that the team is effectively assembled, right? That you have Hank Pym, you've got the Wasp, you've got Iron Man operating under the name Iron Lad, Captain America, Thor, and Dr. Doom. Starkly different, no pun intended, from the original Ultimates that we saw in Marvel Comics. But it is cool because while all the other comics in the Ultimate Universe right now are focusing on the origins of these characters leading up to the 6-month mark and when they're likely going to be visited by Tony Stark and so on and so forth, this story involving Tony and them, the Ultimates, is largely going to be looking at the much bigger picture. What happens in 18 months, or really 17 months at this point, when the Maker re-emerges, right? Battle formations. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. I think this comic is solid. Let me know what you think down in the comments section, and I will catch you all next month when issue number 2 comes out. Peace.